Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today I'm going to turn a live edge or natural edge bowl from this piece of black cherry. I just got this recently from my neighbor and it is actually just beautiful wood. It's mellowed out, it's sat for a couple months. It's not soaking wet, but it still has moisture in it. I found that with black cherry, it turns best when it's had a little bit of time to rest. Typically the sapwood is very wet when it's first cut. So that extremely wet sapwood with the interior heartwood sometimes doesn't like to dry evenly, and you see a lot of cracking, especially in that sapwood. So I kind of like to let the black cherry logs mellow out. So I'm going to take this over to the bandsaw and we're going to cut this up and get started.
I'm going to make a small piece out of this compared to the size of the log. Now, you might be thinking, why don't I move that off to one side? Well, there are cracks that are forming on the sapwood, and I do not know how far those are coming in. So I'm going to concentrate the bowl blank towards the center of this piece and use the best material that's right in the middle. Now, it also helps that I've got several of these logs. They can be used a little more sparingly, or I can make a larger bowl from it. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to design a smaller piece that has a rim that is relatively similar in height all the way around. Now the sides of course will drop down as you're seeing right there, but it won't be quite as dramatic as if I use this entire log. This is going to be more of a decorative piece that's designed to sit on a table or on a shelf and be a really interesting conversation piece, or something that's a little bit more elegant. We're going for elegance versus function here. The material in the center of this log is gorgeous. You can see all the rings there. You can see how nice this little chunk is. Now the first thing I need to do is I need to remove some of the bark. I'm going to be using the 4-spur drive center, and that will dig into the wood pretty good, and it'll dig right through this bark. So I want to make sure I've got a good connection, so I'm going to remove some of the bark first. I could anchor this against something, but I want to show you guys that I'm chiseling it, so I'm kind of chiseling it without much support there. Now the reason that I'm using the 4-spur drive center and the tailstock is I want to be able to adjust the height of the wings. If I were just to turn this, or if I were to put it on a faceplate for instance, it's going to be pretty difficult to line up the wings. See right here I can see this one side's a little bit higher than the other, so I can loosen up the tailstock and just move it a hair. And by doing that, I can bring both of the sides pretty much together and make that unified and balanced. I'm going to use my 5/8 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge to rough out the shape of this. Going to go across and clean up and create the bottom curve of this bowl. It's relatively balanced, and I've got the speed up about as fast as I want to get with this because this is a pretty good sized mass of wood at this point. You can see I've got the nose of the bowl gouge pointing in the direction of the cut, and I'm doing a supported grain cut, meaning in this case, because it's a side grain mounted bowl, I'm moving from the base up to the rim. If you want to learn more about supported grain cuts, you're going to really want to check out this video when you get done with this one. Just take your time and peel away those layers. You can see I'm only using a small portion of the left side of the nose of the bowl gouge at this point to cut. I just love the look of that cherry. It's absolutely gorgeous. Now I'm going to go ahead and flatten off the base of this and get ready to do the tenon and the shoulder. Now I've switched over to my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. Now I'm doing most of my bowl turning with these two gouges. I like using the 5/8 inch gouge when I'm roughing out material. also when I need to reach down into places, like if I need to reach into the bottom of the bowl and I need to extend the tool over the tool rest, the 5/8 inch gouge gives me that extra support. It doesn't vibrate as much as the 1/2 inch gouge will. But the 1/2 inch gouge is great for making really nice, fine finishing cuts. So I'm shaping the tenon. And I'm going to make the shoulder of this a little bit higher than normal because I want to have some options for the foot later on. I might make this a little bit taller as far as the foot is concerned. So the tenon is shaped, and now the shoulder is going to be shaped. Take your time with these cuts. Now I'm a little bit more aggressive here because I'm just roughing out the material. If these were finishing cuts, I'd be making a much lighter cut. All right, and I want to show you this camera angle because I want you to see what I'm doing. From the tenon and the shoulder, which are established now, I'm going to curve the shape of the bowl up to the top rim. It's part of the reason why I like to establish the tenon and the shoulder right away, so that I can really have a point from which I'm working from up to the rim of the bowl. This wood is containing a little bit of moisture. It's nothing like it was a month or two ago. It was really wet. I found that the cherry wood seems to turn best after it's had a month or two to rest. Still holding plenty of moisture, but it's not as sopping wet as when it's first cut. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a scraping cut and a scraping pull cut to shape that bottom portion. Now the reason I'm using this here is it's really hard to get the nose of the bowl gouge down into that corner to start a cut. So what I'll do is I'll pull and scrape out a cut, then I'll turn around and I'll make a push cut. I'm starting to get the curve and the form of the bowl the way I want. I'm liking the way this looks. So I'm going to continue with the scraping cut. And I can drop that handle and make it a shear scrape, which is just a very light shave to level off the areas or the transition areas between those two cuts. So the transition between that pull cut and the push cut, I can just lightly shave that with the shear scrape here. Okay, so now I'm going to work from the rim down because I want to retain the bark on this, or at least try to. The bark is always a delicate issue. Black cherry is pretty good about retaining bark, but it can vary depending on the age of the wood and how long it's had to equalize or dry. So in order to help maintain the bark on this, instead of going up to the rim in a traditional supported grain cut, I'm going to actually work down from the bark. I've got a couple low spots there that need to be addressed. So by moving from left to right, I'm actually pushing the bark down onto the wood, so it has less of a chance of getting snapped off while I'm making these cuts. If I were going the other way, I'm actually pushing from the base of the bark outward, and I could easily pry that bark right off the bowl itself. So I'm also going to make this a closed rim bowl, meaning that the rim is narrower than the widest point of the bowl. So that apex, or the widest area of the bowl, is going to be about right there. And what I'm doing is I'm merging the cut from the top rim and the upper cut from the bottom section. I still have a low spot, so I've got to remove a little more material here. Now I'm using my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. And I just sharpened this so that I'm making a really clean cut and not ripping out ingrain fibers. Just want to make sure you've got a really, really nice clean cut. Now you can see the edge there where the two cuts match. That's not going to be a problem. I just want to make sure I got all those low spots, and that's looking good. So I'm going to go back to the shear scrape. if you notice, the tool rest is positioned perpendicular to the tool. That's the way you want to do that for a shear scrape. This is not where you would position the tool rest for most other cuts. But with the shear scrape, the tool is extended beyond the tool rest, and you really need that 90-degree support. So if you look at the top of this bowl, you can see those little ridges at the top, those transition areas. Well, that's what the shear scrape is excellent for, is essentially you could erase those. You can just gently shave those sections until they become level and merge together. I like to think of the shear scrape as like a magic eraser tool for bowl turning, because it literally does erase lines, it erases transitions, and that's looking pretty good. All right, I'm going to shape the base or the foot of this. I don't like the way it looks right now. One of the things I learned from David Ellsworth is that you really want to make this shape visible so that you know what you're working with. And I want to make sure that I know where the flowing curve of the base of this bowl is and the way I want it to appear. So I'm going to establish that right now. The way it was before, it was a little too straight and kind of clunky looking. I'm also going to shape the tenon, the dovetail on the tenon, and we'll be ready to turn this around. And I'm using my spindle detail gouge to do those two cuts. It's great for getting into those tight corners. Now I'm going to go back to my regular bowl gouge, and I'm going to do a shear scrape to merge the area at the base of the bowl where I just cut into the previous area, just to smooth that out. And that's looking really good. Okay, so I'm going to get this turned around and get it in the 4-jaw chuck. Yeah, I have a plastic washer on my headstock because there's one of my chucks has a slight gap. It doesn't like to seat all the way down, and you have to have all of your chucks and faceplates seat all the way down to the base of the headstock, or there's going to be vibration in them. So if for some reason they don't, you can make up that gap with the plastic washer like you saw there. I'll put a link to that and all the tools I'm using for this turning in the description below. Okay, so I'm going to remove some of the bark here so that I can get down to the working area. The intention of this is to make it pretty thin. Actually, I would like it to be really thin. So I'm going to take my time and I'm going to work out to that wall, and I'm going to establish the thin wall thickness initially and just work all the way down the bowl until we get this complete. I'm using my 1/2-inch bowl gouge here. Get down into all sapwood there. We'll take a look at that. It's looking pretty good. The bark's holding on pretty well. I'm going to focus now on just that side wall area and establish the wall thickness. What I'm doing is I'm lining up the bevel of the bowl gouge to the exterior of the bowl. I'm looking straight down on it, and I'm making sure the two are parallel, and I'm making light cuts. I'm going to remove some material here so I can get down into that wall and make the wall thinner. This is a really good time to sharpen the tool because I want to make sure that each one of these passes is really clean and I'm not ripping out any ingrained fibers, because if I make this as thin as I really want it to be, it's going to be very thin and there's not going to be much room for air as far as sanding or doing much. So I want to make sure I've got a really clean, smooth surface, and sharpening the tool is a great idea. That should do it. Got that edge back. You can see here how I'm lining up the bevel to the exterior of the bowl. Just removing material very lightly. And now I'm going to remove a little more material and get that inside little section right down to the wall. I would like to make this thinner, but I'm going to need to get some of this material out of the way. So I'm going to make a push cut to get this material out of the way. Going to scrape this down, and then I've got the wall section. And the other thing too with the closed rim bowl is you've got tons of debris will be caught by that rim because it's narrower than the area that you're turning. The bowl's looking great. Oops, sorry about that. I'm bumping the camera. I'm actually looking through around the camera because I want to show you guys exactly what I'm seeing. You can see how I'm lining that up with the exterior of the wall just to get that wall thickness to match up. And I work down into this little crevice here, and then I will clear an area and come back and continue that wall thickness. I need to get some of this material out of the way so that I can get back down there and get a little deeper. Oh! I was afraid that might happen. All right, so my tenon sheared off. Well, there's a variety of different things that happened here. The material, the wood at the bottom had a little bit of a crack going through it, and obviously that contributed to this. I was making a push cut away from the center of the headstock. The bowl looks pretty good. I got some barks missing there. All right, well, guess what? We're not quitting. You do not want to give up on this. So I'm going to remount this. And luckily we've got enough space there with that larger foot that I made. I should be able to put a tenon on this and keep going. Big thing to take away from this is don't give up. Just keep going. The worst thing that can happen is it doesn't turn out. Okay, so, well, actually, the worst thing that can happen is if this comes flying off the lathe and then you stop or you quit and you think, I don't want to do that anymore, it's too dangerous. It's not the case. There were several issues that happened right there that made that all occur. I was also not turning the tenon to the actual size. I have two chucks. I have one that's 2 inches and one that's 4 inches. And the 2-inch one is small, and it's great for smaller pieces, but it's too small for this, I feel. And the 4-inch is too big. It's great for larger pieces, but it's too big for this piece. I really need a 3-inch set of jaws, and I've yet to find 3-inch dovetail jaws that fit my chuck. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn a tenon here that's actually 2 inches. And what happened is I was actually trying to cheat. I was making a tenon that was a little bit bigger than 2 inches, probably closer to 3 inches, and I opened the jaws of the 2-inch chuck. When you open the jaws of the 2-inch chuck, what's happening is I'm not getting a good circular connection all the way around the tenon. Instead, I just had 8 points that were gripping it. So it's easy to wedge it out of the chuck. So there's a variety of things that happen. Because I know what happened, I'm not too upset or, I guess, agitated by this. I knew there was a chance that could happen. So, plus, the cut that I was making was just a little too aggressive. I can come back and make lighter cuts, and I shouldn't have the problem. I was feeling a little bit of resistance with the bowl gouge as I was turning that. I'm going to bring the tailstock up just for a moment to see and make sure everything's lined up. And I'm bringing it up for stability because what I have to do now is I have to retrue the exterior of this bowl. Now, when I put it in between centers just a second ago and returned the tenon, it actually lined up really close to center right from the beginning. Here's the little catch and dirty little secret is there's no way in the world that you're going to line that up perfectly centered the way it was originally on the lathe. So what you do in a case like this is you mount it back to the lathe and then you true up the exterior. So as you're seeing it wobble on the lathe there, what's happening is it's not completely centered. So one side's coming by high and another side's low. So if you make a steady shaving cuts, I'm basically just scraping right now. I'm just removing material. You make shaping cuts to reshape the exterior so the exterior is smooth. Then you can go back into the interior and you should be okay. Getting the exterior perfectly round or as true as possible before turning the interior is really only vital when you're turning a really thin piece. If I had made the walls of this bowl, say, a 1/2 inch thick, I can get away with the outside being a little bit wobbly. What's going to happen is the interior walls will have a little bit of variation in thickness from one side to the other. Now, where I'm going to run into trouble with this bowl is the fact that I've already cut down a couple inches of that top wall and I made it really thin. So there's a good chance that one of those wings is going to be thicker than the other one. We already know this is wobbling a little bit. So if one is thicker than the other and it's already thin, I'm just going to go ahead and take this bark off because it's already partially damaged from bouncing off the floor. Which brings up another good point is my lathe speed was below 1,000 RPMs. I don't have an RPM readout on my lathe, but I just know the feeling of this rotation of the bowl. And one of the indications and one of the kind of the rule of thumb is that if the RPMs of the lathe is above 1,000 RPMs, when the bowl comes off, it has a chance of going upward, like meaning upward into your face or into your body, which is obviously not good. And under 1,000 RPMs, it has a tendency to go down and down to the floor, and that's what it did. So luckily, all the safety protocols were in place, and I obviously have my face shield on, I have my goggles on, and I was not standing in the line of fire. The line of fire is basically the path in front and behind the lathe where the rotating bowl blank is, because that's typically where it's going to fly, unless it gets caught up on something. If it gets caught up on the tool rest or something and gets redirected, it's pretty much going to go straight off the lathe, either in front or behind the lathe. So I'm going to go and reestablish this wall thickness and see if I can get down there. It looks like I'm going to be able to match this up. From here, at this point, it looks like I'm getting down to the original wall thickness. I'm a little bit leery though, because I know that there was a wobble in that when I put it back on the lathe. And let's take a look. That looks pretty good. I'm going to get that bark off of there. It's actually, the bark was actually holding on pretty good. All right, so the lesson learned here is lighter cuts. I don't want to put a lot of excessive force on that small tenon. So I'm going to make light cuts. Just going to shave away a little bit of material at a time. I don't have to get aggressive with it. It's kind of like getting back on the saddle or getting back in the saddle again if you fall off a horse. You don't want to leave this sit for long. If you have an incident like this, the quicker you can get this piece back on the lathe or get another piece on the lathe, the better, because it just gets it out of your mind. It makes you realize everything's fine. And there's that ledge. Yeah, this is not going to work. See, that one side is really high there. The one wall actually is pretty close to being accurate, but the other wall is thick, just because when I re-established the new tenon, it wasn't perfectly centered. But we're going to give it the old college try here, and we're going to go ahead and I'll remove the material in the inside of this so you guys can get an idea of what I was intending to do with this bowl. Although this probably is not going to be a keeper. It's rather unfortunate because it's a beautiful piece of wood. Yeah, so back to the point there is don't give up. Just get back in there and give it another try. If you can save the piece that you have and put a new tenon on like I just did, then do it. If you can't, then that's fine too. Grab something else and just keep turning. The first time this happens, I know from experience, first time this happens to you is you get the jitters and you get a little bit rattled. So it's a really good idea. Get something simple on the lathe and just turn and relax and just realize everything's going to be fine. And then if you don't know what happened, you really need to spend some time and analyze it and think about it. What do you think went wrong? And really spend some time and figure that out. Because if you don't know for sure what happened, there's a good chance you're just going to repeat that. And obviously you don't want that to happen. And if you have the unknown of not knowing what happened, it's also going to make you believe that this could happen at any moment at any other time. And that's usually not the case. That was a very specific moment. I was way out on the front of this bowl blank, and I was applying a little bit too much pressure. The tenon gave way. It wasn't held in the chuck properly, and the wood had a fracture by the pith that actually I should have turned the base of this down a little bit farther and gotten past that crack. Now, if I couldn't get past that crack, I could have also glued it. I could have put some glue or some CA in there just to hold that crack and give it a little bit additional support so that it hangs on while I'm turning this. I do that a lot with tenons of punky wood. Sometimes I'll have pecan that can get really punky, and it just gets brittle and fragile. What I'll do with the tenons on those is I'll take that entire area of the tenon and the shoulder and I'll saturate it with shellac. And that shellac acts like an adhesive. Well, it is an adhesive, and it soaks down into those pores and hardens that material and makes it much more stable compared to the way it is originally. I haven't sheared off, I don't know that I've ever sheared off a black cherry tenon before. I've sheared off a couple pecan tenons before. I was kind of expecting that because the wood was so punky and brittle. So I'm making relatively light cuts. I'm not being too cautious, overly cautious here, but I'm also paying attention to my bowl gouge. If I need to apply some force here, or if I'm applying a little extra pressure, there's a good chance that the edge is dull. Just a simple trip over to the sharpening station is going to refresh that edge, and it's going to cut with a lot of ease. And that's what you want here. You want to be cutting this wood with as little pressure and as little force as possible. I'm basically just walking the cutting edge along each of these cuts. I'm not forcing it and shoving it into the wood. That's the last thing you want. And that's when you're going to have issues, is if you're forcing your tools to cut. It's also a really good sign that they're dull and need to be sharpened. I'll get that last bit of bark off there. And this is still a beautiful natural edge bowl. If you don't look on the inside and see this weird ledge on the one side, it's almost acceptable. Yeah, not quite. But you know what? Some great lessons in here. And hopefully you guys can learn from my mistakes. And if you learn nothing else, just know that you don't give up. Because this is going to happen to everybody. You're going to have a piece come off the lathe at one point or another. It's no big deal. I mean, after all, think about it. We have a big chunk of wood that's just ripping around in a circle pretty darn fast. It's pretty amazing it stays on as much as it does stay on. And remember, you can see how I'm working off to this side. That's typically where we're positioned, off to one side or the other. And there are occasions when you do need to stand in front of the piece. You just need to be aware when you're doing that there's a chance that thing can come off. So I'm working down from the walls to the inside. I'm taking some of this inside material out. And I'm getting to the point with my 1/2-inch bowl gouge that I'm extending pretty far beyond the tool rest, and I'm getting a little bit of vibration. Don't quite have a clean of support that I need. This is a great opportunity for the 5/8-inch bowl gouge, which I'm going to switch to in a second. You can see there I'm extending maybe 5 inches beyond the tool rest, and that gives that steel the opportunity to vibrate a bit and move around. just one section at a time. If you saw there, I'm working a section of the bottom wall at about an inch wide, and then I'll take the center down. This process of working the walls and then removing the center all started from turning live edge and natural edge bowls, because I can't really, especially if you're going to do a thin one, it's really hard to remove the center and then come up to a live edge wing that's flapping around and establish a really thin, nice, even wall thickness. But by leaving the center in, working the wall areas, and then taking the center out, it's much easier. All right, so I'm switching over to the 5/8 inch bowl gouge. And I'll continue removing material here. I didn't end up turning this as thin as I wanted to. I really wanted to make this a nice and elegantly thin bowl for display, but it's getting thrown off the lathe obviously changed the plans. I didn't know that I had those lessons for you guys today. How to deal with the bowl when it comes flying off the lathe. Rule number 1 is don't give up. Okay, so the bottom of the bowl is pretty much established. So what I'm going to do, a really light open pass there. You can see how the flute's almost completely open. And then right at the center, I'm going to come back to 90 degrees. So I'm rubbing the heel, rubbing the bevel, picking up the cut. I'm cutting, if you see, I'm cutting on the left side of the bowl gouge. Across the center, over to the right side. I'm going to turn the bowl gouge to 90 degrees so I don't get any kickbacks. And I'm just going to let the edge cut that last fiber. And that's looking pretty good. For what it is, it's looking pretty good. All right, I'm going to sand this up just a little bit. I am going to apply oil to this because I want to take a look at what it looks like, even though I know I'm not going to keep this one. So basically go around and sand all the different areas. I'm looking for any kind of scratch marks, things like that. And then I'm going to sand the rim. There's the cambium layer that's right below the bark, or the base of the bark layer leaves a little bit of residue there. You have to really sand into. For a natural edge piece like this, make sure you're sanding with the contour of the rim. You can see how I'm rotating the pad to the side, then back up to flat perpendicular. Follow the edge of the bark or the surface of the wood so it just looks right that way. I've seen people try to level that off, make it all flat all the way around, and it appears odd. So I'm going to apply some tried and true Danish oil. This is pure linseed oil. And just get a look and see what this bowl could have been. It's actually a gorgeous bowl. Well, you win some and you lose some. You can see those inside rims. The top edge of that. All right, it's looking pretty good. For what it is, at least.
All right, I'm going to stop right there because mistakes were made and this bowl is not going to get any better. Yeah, it looks pretty cool, and you could see what it should look like from the outside at least. It turned out pretty good even after having to re-level the exterior and smooth that out. However, it just didn't quite line up close enough in order to have a good clean interior. I have this ledge on the inside from where I started the wall but couldn't match it up here. But on this side, it almost matched up. Now, I could have sanded that and leveled that out. This is a little bit trickier. I'm looking at 1/8 of an inch there, maybe 8 millimeters. It's pretty wide. So that's just too inconsistent. It didn't line up quite perfectly. Now, the beauty of this video and this turning for you is that you got to learn so many different lessons from my mistake. Yep. And that's the beauty of mistakes. When you make a mistake, make sure that you're learning from it. Don't repeat the mistake. Well, You might repeat the mistake, but don't repeat the mistake because you don't know what happened. Make sure you learn what happened. One of the things that we need to remember when a catastrophic incident like this happens is there's usually multiple things that contribute to failure, and that's the case here. First of all, the pith area was right at the location of the tenon. And as a matter of fact, you can still see a hairline crack in here on the existing tenon, or the second tenon that I made to correct the first one. That hairline crack contributed for sure. Now that alone probably wasn't going to be the issue. The next thing that contributed was the fact that I used this 2-inch chuck. Now, why did I use this 2-inch chuck? Well, I used the 2-inch chuck because I wanted to be able to see the shape of the bowl really well. I wanted to be able to see that bottom curve and how it was going to meet into the foot. Now, the workaround for that and to really make a nice secure connection would be using my 4-inch chuck. But as you can see, that would have made this great big huge base. It would have made it a little bit tricky to see what was going on down there, but it would have given me a lot of added extra support. Had I used this large base, I would have had to have turned part of the exterior, turned all of the interior, and then come back and reshape the exterior, hoping to match that wall thickness. I like to do the whole exterior and then match the interior to the exterior so that wall is evenly thick all the way down. So with that being said, I do not know of any manufacturer that makes a 3-inch chuck or jaws for a 3-inch jaws for a chuck, because that's where I'm at. I'm in a 2-inch dovetail and a 4-inch dovetail. If there were 3-inch dovetail jaws, if Vicmark or One Way or Hurricane out there is listing, 3-inch jaws would have given me really good support, but it would have also allowed me to see this area a little bit better here. Now, I'm not blaming the chuck. What happened is I opened this chuck up and I made it larger than it should have been. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what happens is this jaw assembly is milled in a metal lathe all at the same time, ironically. It's all milled as one piece and then it's cut apart. So if you look, there's a point where your jaws make a perfect circle, but there's still a gap in there. Well, that gap is the kerf from the saw, the metal saw that cut these apart. So these all match one another. When this chuck is closed in a circle configuration, we have the most contact with those dovetails to the tenon on the bowl. When I open this up really wide like I did for this bowl, so I can get about a 3-inch connection, which would have worked well, instead of making a nice continuous connection all around, essentially the corners from each of these are digging into the tenon, and that's it. So I really have 8 points of contact, and they're more like spikes in there. And those spikes can dig in and also fracture that wood. And as a matter of fact, you can see this in the part of the tenon, the first tenon that broke off. You can see where the corners were digging into the side. I was not making full contact with the chuck to this tenon because it was opened and I had just the corners that were catching down in the bottom of that. So a little bit larger jaw assembly would have been great, but I didn't have it. So trying to compromise by expanding this wasn't the best thing to do. Now, I have done that in the past and gotten away with it, but it is not the recommended thing to be doing. Now, the final contributing factor was the fact that I was putting too much force away from the headstock. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about the headstock being this axle or on this axis, and we've got the chuck mounted to that, and this is, just imagine this is the bowl blank out here. Well, if we're working towards the center and we're making those push cuts, like you see me make those stair-stepped push cuts to clear out the middle, well, I'm basically pushing into the headstock. I'm not really putting too much leverage or force on this headstock assembly or the chuck. However, when I'm out on the edge of the bowl and I'm applying force, you can see how much easier it is for me to lever this. Well, that's what was happening. I was applying too much force with the bowl gouge and I could feel it. I should have been making lighter cuts, either going slower or making thinner cuts so that I wasn't having to apply pressure. And when I applied that pressure, I essentially added to snapping that tenon off. So the pressure of the cut, the fracture of the tenon crack inside the tenon, and the fact that the tenon was a little too small and I was using a chuck that wasn't really sized properly, all contributed to the bowl shooting off the lathe. Now, luckily, I was applying all of my safety techniques, which I had my shield on, I had my glasses on, and I wasn't standing in the line of fire. If you notice, that bowl just shot right past me and bounced on the floor. Really didn't cause any damage other than to the bowl itself and the tenon. So all of the safety protocols and practices were in place, thankfully, so there were no injuries, and there's really no reason to be too upset about this. I realize the first time this happens, it can be a little bit jarring and a little bit unnerving if you're turning, especially if you're turning by yourself, but realize it's a simple thing of looking at what happened, determine what mistakes were made, how you can correct those in the future, and then move forward. If you can't figure it out, then talk with some people or write a comment in the comment below this video and I'll do my best to help you out and figure out what mistakes might have been happening for you if you had an incident like this. Either way, you need to understand what mistakes occurred so that you can learn from them. And then don't repeat them, because if you repeat a mistake over and over again, that's just going to create frustration and misery. All right, guys, I hope you've learned a lot from this video. I think it's loaded with tons of valuable tips and information, especially if you run into issues like this. And if you've liked this video, do me a huge favor and click that like button. I thank you so much for doing that. It helps me out, helps the channel, helps this video, helps everything. Also, subscribe if you're not subscribing, and check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. Over there, I've got tons of information, and I've got online courses that are going to help you learn all the ins and outs of turning wood bowls. All right, guys, as always, until next time, thank you so much for watching, and happy turning.